To try to make this relatively quick. Really just focus on the relevant things for your paper, basically. Rousseau, social contract. There's a lot you could say here. Rousseau can be a little bit deceptive because sometimes he's talking and he'll sort of say these things and he can seem, he's in some ways a very fluid, a very compelling, a very gifted writer, but sometimes when he's saying things, he's actually making fairly discrete important arguments, even if they seem a little bit sort of they're more just kind of indicated rather than fully spelled out. So I mean, he can be deceptive because you can read a paragraph or two, and he's actually making a series of specific points, and it's not always obvious from reading it. So there's a lot you could say about this. There's a lot you could say even just about these selections from the social contract. I'm really not going to talk much about the stuff from book 3, the different forms of government. He talks about religion there. Again, a lot of interesting stuff. Those video lectures I had on the discourse on inequality end up being far more than I thought, actually. They're much longer than I thought. There are more of them. So there's plenty of information there. A little bit focused here on the kind of some of the specific questions that your paper deals with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Rousseau's relation to ancient political thought and modern political thought, okay? So on the one hand, he obviously critiques modernity. He's kind of dissatisfied with a lot of what he sees in terms of the modern world. You see that especially in the discourse on inequality. It's much more obvious there that he has a real problem with society as it's developed in the modern world. And in fact, in the discourse on inequality, he says a couple of times that the world, that society is just going downhill and basically it will forever. That there was a kind of a golden period, or at least a good time. The state of nature was good. He seems to think actually that this kind of intermediate stage, this kind of tribal family kind of life that we had that was still not fully developed, and in particular did not have permanent private property, therefore did not have the dependence that people have on each other and the kind of permanent inequality. He seems to think that was actually the best time, but once we passed over and now we have this society that features things like private property and therefore inequality and therefore the loss of this natural freedom and this necessary dependence that people have on one another, that's just fundamentally flawed and there's no way to make it better. And it would just continue to get worse and worse and worse. And that's kind of where he leaves off. I don't think that was that particular part of that particular passage from the discourse on inequality was in the selections in your reader, but that's kind of where he makes that point a couple of times, and kind of where he leaves off the whole book is basically that we're only going to get worse from here. The social contract is kind of a more positive part of what he's doing in his writing generally. The social contract is, in a way, kind of the solution. Now, Rousseau kind of comes up with two solutions. One of them is what you see here in the social contract, and that's kind of the more political one. The way of like, here's how we could maybe create a form of political society that is actually relatively good and is still based on nature and still honors the importance of natural freedom, but also develops it in a way that actually makes it better that we're out of the state of nature, that we're actually better off now than we were previously. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. The other major path that Rousseau's thought takes, following from that kind of problem that he identifies and lays out in the discourse on inequality, the other major path that it takes is towards a more kind of, well, basically what becomes known as romanticism. So more of a return to nature in society. We can never get back to the state of nature, but kind of more of a return through things like being more kind of authentic, more genuine, more sincere, really being honest about what we feel, and less concerned with convention and so on. And then also kind of expressing that emotion more important than reason, nature more important than society, certainly nature more important than industry and things like that. So that's one kind of major cultural development that kind of follows from Rousseau and from what he says, not just in the discourse on inequality, but that's one of the major places. And then the other one is the social contract, okay? So what is Rousseau's critique of modernity? You know, if you look at what is his relation to modern political thought? What is his relationship to ancient political thought? What does he think of modern political thought? How is he critical of it? Looking kind of at both writings, what does he say? And you kind of put it in broad terms, just kind of summarize it here. One of his major problems with the modern world is there's too much focus on self-preservation, on staying alive, the idea that society and human life really is all about self-preservation. He thinks is a massive mistake. And in a way, even worse, the other, to the extent that there's something in modern life beyond simple self-preservation, the idea that there's a goal or a purpose or anything like that, beyond simple self-preservation, it's things like luxury and comfort and luxurious living and things like that, what Hobbes calls commodious living. I think that's also terrible and bad. Prosperity, I guess, would be the way that Locke would put it. And he thinks it's bad because this notion of prosperity, comfort, luxury in particular, but really the focus on prosperity and what we would probably call economic growth and things like that. The problem that Rousseau has with that is that he thinks that it creates and really thrives on the creation of false needs. So the issue with luxury, and he talks about this in various places, but the issue with luxury is, we kind of come to rely on something that we don't really need. And maybe at first it seems kind of nice, but pretty quickly we become too accustomed to it. So let me take something, simple, I don't know, a pillow, a soft bed or whatever, something that at one point we were fine living without. We become not only, maybe for the first couple of nights, it's nice to sleep on a softer bed, but pretty soon it becomes something that we really need and we're less free. And in a way, we're corrupted because we have to continue to maintain that. I mean, a nice bed, maybe you buy every few years and you're okay. But a lot of the other luxuries we need to continually replenish. So he thinks that it creates these false needs. And then we become obsessed with satisfying those needs, which again are not natural, they're not real. So the idea of prosperity, luxury, things like that, he thinks destroys our natural freedom, and then also this economy that it creates, this kind of modern, complex economy that you need to provide things like luxuries, whatever they are, consumer goods, things that you might eat, things that you might wear, whatever it is, that relies on the existence and the creation and the promotion of this inequality. And the inequality is where people, as he talks about in the discourse on inequality, when you get this inequality, that's where people start to worry very much about where they fit into society and what rank they're at. And they start to think, and that's where all that stuff that Hobbes says about the importance of power in human life and how much we're thinking about how much power or how much reputation we have compared to other people and where we fit in and how we can get more power, or whether this person doesn't like us or doesn't respect us or whatever. How can we kind of project and secure the most amount of power from other people, the most amount of reputation and therefore influence, the ability to get what we want, where we realize we're dependent on other people whom we really don't care about inherently, only as means to our end. So all that stuff that Hobbes talks about in Leviathan, especially chapter 10, which Hobbes says just is human nature, Rousseau says that's the product of the society that we've created, not really consciously, but the society that is developed and that we're now trapped in. So Rousseau's problem with modern political thought, the focus on self-preservation is wrong. I'll get back to that in a second. The focus on prosperity or industry or economic growth, as we might say, the focus on comfort, on luxury, these are all bad things. Again, these create false needs that we then become somewhat dependent on, and they require, and again, they further aggravate and they further intensify and promote that kind of inequality that Rousseau thinks is really the worst thing about modern society, because it's the loss of natural freedom. And it's also then the dependence that people have on each other, the dependence, the obsession that they start to have with where they fit into that kind of that social pecking order, and that's when they become totally alienated. Totally, well, I'll just use the word alienated, we'll come back to this a little bit, totally alienated from their true selves. What I am as a person is very different from my reputation in society, and in society, because I have to rely so much on other people, and the way that the simplest way that I have to rely on them is it really kind of concerns what they think of me in terms of what they think of the reputation. So not actually me, but the kind of social image of me that exists through the way that I dress, through the way that I talk, through the job that I have, through the car that I drive. All the ways that I project certain things about myself to people become very important to how much influence, what Hobbes calls power, you would have in society. And Rousseau says that's a terrible thing because you stop being a real creature, a real being, a real living thing that is good and is happy to be alive and can take pleasure in real experiences like satisfying basic physical needs, laying in the sun, basic good physical, real, pleasant experiences. And instead we become obsessed with this image of ourselves that doesn't even really exist in any direct, immediate way, but it absolutely exists in society. Okay, so that's part of the problem with inequality and the focus on prosperity, or the focus on self-preservation, the focus on life. The idea, which is so important to Hobbes, but also Locke, the idea that life and preserving life is in some way fundamental to political life and to society. Rousseau says that gets it wrong. Life is important because it's the condition of the good life. You can't be happy if you're not alive. You can't live a good life if you're not alive. The focus on life for its own sake reverses things and just distorts everything. So here he's kind of close to Aristotle. Remember, Aristotle said the city comes into being for the sake of living, but it exists for the sake of living well. Remember, for Aristotle, to understand what something really is, you don't look at what it was like to begin with. You look at when it develops in a natural way according to the, kind of the internal principles of that thing, what its nature is. Look at what something is as when it's fully developed. To understand what a human being is, you don't look at a zygote, you don't look at a baby, you don't look at a 10-year-old, and you don't look at a person who has kind of had terrible things happen to them and failed to develop what human beings are capable of. You look at a fully developed human being who can speak, who can reason, who can live a moral life. That's what you look at. In the same way with the city, Aristotle says you don't look at what it began as, maybe a partnership for survival and reproduction and things like that, basic physical needs. You look at what it develops into under the right conditions. And what it develops into is a partnership for the sake of living well, creating a community where people talk about and understand among each other, well, what is justice? And how do we create a society? And how do we create laws and institutions and a way of life that really kind of embodies and makes that conception of justice that we have a reality. Okay, so that's Aristotle, right? And Rousseau, and again, Aristotle, city comes into being for the sake of living. Existence is important, and maybe chronologically it's important early on to stay alive, self-preservation, but that's not really the purpose of politics. And Rousseau agrees with that there. He's kind of like an ancient there, and he says, the focus in the modern world on self-preservation, and then things like prosperity or luxury, these are all wrong. Okay, and so you see he has a positive view of ancient republics and the social contract in particular. He has good things to say about Lycurgus, this kind of founder of Sparta, may or may not have really existed, but the point is, obviously Hobbes, Locke, they're not really praising societies like ancient Sparta. Both of them have their issues with what Sparta was all about. I mean, they may occasionally see something valuable or thought that Lycurgus or whoever had some good ideas or something, but they really don't have nearly as the kind of the positive view of the ancient republic that Rousseau does in the social contract. Okay, so in that way, he's very critical of modern political thought and modern political reality in particular. But what does he propose in its place? Okay. And in this way, he remains, in a lot of ways, really still fundamentally modern. Okay, and you can see that in the first place because, of course, he talks about the state of nature. And the state of nature is obviously, the ancients knew about it. You see it in the Republic. Glaucon kind of has discusses where justice may have originated. That's basically, he's talking about something like the state of nature. But the modern idea, state of nature, we're fundamentally individuals. We're isolated and we're completely free in the state of nature. And Rousseau sticks with that kind of Hobbesian, Lockean idea that when you want to understand what people are, and when you want to understand, therefore, what society is, what government is, and what it should be, what you're going to do is you're going to start by thinking about what people were originally. So not what they develop into, like Aristotle says, but what were they originally? And what they were originally, fundamentally, Rousseau says, agreeing with Hobbes and Locke here, is they lived in a state of nature where there was no society, there was no politics. In fact, as you know from the Discourse on Inequality, Rousseau says Hobbes doesn't go far enough. He doesn't think through the idea of people being fundamentally non-social, non-political, because if they were, they wouldn't have had speech. All of these ideas, all these sources of conflict that Hobbes imagines that do exist in society would not have existed in the state of nature. They're the product of society, they're the product of political life, they don't exist originally. So Rousseau says, what does it mean to be human? We need to look at the state of nature. We need to look at the very beginning. What we find there is fundamentally free, isolated people who have no real natural connection to each other and don't want to have any natural connection to each other. So how do we, as this famous line, everywhere, a man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. So how did that happen? Rousseau says, it's a long story, I don't know, but I think I can justify it. So when we talk about not what did happen, that's kind of the discourse on inequality. When we talk about what should happen, how can we justify that society? Rousseau says, well, we should think of it in terms of a contract. So again, you have that idea of naturally free, isolated individual people who have no real natural basis for community or for politics. They come together, they form a contract. They agree to enter into society. They agree to give up their natural freedom in some way. And yet what Rousseau says, very different obviously than Hobbes and also than Locke really in his own way. What he says is the contract above all must preserve this natural freedom. Not in the sense that Locke has, that the government can only do so much to get into your whatever. Rousseau says the real issue is And in this way, he's very radical, very original. The full implications of what he does here, how important it is, and how much it really just, in many ways, deepens, but also kind of redirects modern political thought in a lot of ways. All of this doesn't necessarily emerge until a generation or two or many after Rousseau. So what he starts to say is the contract has to preserve this original natural freedom, not just in the sense of carving out an area of negative freedom where the government can't interfere, but it actually has to preserve that real and kind of fundamental psychological, meaningful sense. It has to preserve that original freedom. And how do you do that? Well, Rousseau says the way that you do that, this phrase he comes up with one point, is you need to create a society where you can have the harmony of obedience and freedom. It sounds paradoxical. How can you be both obedient and free? Hobbes says you should obey. He's not really worried about people being free. And he has that weird justification for that weird redefinition of freedom and how you can do everything that the sovereign says and you're still free. But Rousseau is more like, no, people need to be free in a much more fundamental sense. But you also need to combine obedience, otherwise there's no society. So how do you do that? How do you preserve that fundamental original freedom, and in fact even enhance it, even develop it into something more meaningful? And eventually you'll see Rousseau in the social contract here, he kind of stops talking about original freedom in the state of nature, and he talks about autonomy, and he contrasts that with the liberty that you can have in a free society. Not all societies, everywhere man is in chains, but the right kind of society. You could have liberty that doesn't exist in the state of nature. Autonomy exists, independence exists. You're not reliant on anybody. You're in this big primeval forest. You want to eat some strawberries, you eat some strawberries. You want to drink from the stream, you do that. You take a nap. You don't need anybody for anything. And you certainly don't need to obey anybody. But Rousseau will eventually say here in the social contract, that doesn't mean that you're free. It means that you're autonomous. It means you can do whatever you want to, but you're not free in a meaningful sense. Why not? Well, we'll get into this, okay? But this original natural freedom, extremely important for Rousseau. Society has to preserve that in some sense. And again, it doesn't necessarily preserve it, it actually kind of creates a more meaningful version of it, a more truly human version of it. Which means it's not so much preserving it, but anyways, we don't need to get into all of that right now. Okay, contrast that with the ancients, the medieval thinkers that we've read. Okay, freedom is important as the ability to do the good, but freedom isn't good for its own sake. Okay, freedom is kind of a means to the end, but the idea of freedom as being the ultimate good, or even a fundamental part of the good, rather than just the condition of doing the good, that really wasn't what many of the ancients thought. Okay, this idea that Rousseau has, in a way, again, a very modern idea. It's not what Aristotle thought. It's not what Cicero thought. It's not what Aquinas thought. It's kind of a distinctively modern idea. Not really right, but again, what is Rousseau talking about? Again, you see him use some of the language of the ancient thinkers when he talks about the common good here in the social contract. But the common good here is understood as a matter of harmonizing private interests. Okay, so Rousseau is very much set on the idea of there's a distinction between the private and the public or the common, that's kind of a big thing of what he's doing in the social contract, is trying to figure out what we do about that. How do we put those two things together? So the common good that he's talking about here is basically a matter of harmonizing private interests. It's not about creating a political union or a political community or some form of good through that community, or that community as a kind of good that transcends or is at least different than and kind of more important than individual interests. So in other words, we're all still individuals. We have our own private interests. How do we come together and how do we make that work in society? That's Rousseau's question. For Aristotle, it's sort of like, yeah, we have private interests. You know, I want more money. I want more this or that. But I also have a need as a human being to be a moral person, to be part of a political community, to really participate in that in a meaningful way. And that's ultimately much more important than whatever my interests are as a kind of a rational, selfish, calculating individual. Rousseau, closer to that kind of that definition of interest, and again, closer to that idea of individualism being super, fundamentally important to people and what they are, and therefore how you understand that. So people like Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas on the common good, it's a partnership to achieve this natural impulse, to realize this natural potential that people have towards political community, the practice of virtue that you can only really have in political community. Okay, Rousseau, the common good that he has in mind, I'm kind of oversimplifying to make a point, but really kind of the idea of the common good for Rousseau, it's more that selfish individuals find something they can all agree is good, they find a way of governing themselves, and it doesn't pit the good of the whole against the good of the individual, okay? But there's still that possibility, and we'll see what Rousseau says about that. Okay, so there's this basic idea: individuals brought together for the common good. But what does that mean for Rousseau? Okay, and again, famous line: "Man is born free, but everywhere he is enchained." In chains. How do you justify political life? How do you justify what he calls this alienation from our natural freedom? Okay, and the basic idea is, again, this idea of the harmony of obedience and freedom. We're going to obey laws because we have to live in society, but only laws that we've written for them for ourselves. Okay, so Rousseau says if you are the author of the laws that you obey, then you are still free. In fact, again, you're free in a way that you never were in the state of nature. Because in the state of nature, sure, you did whatever you wanted to. Nobody checked you. Nobody stopped you from doing what you wanted to when you wanted to eat some strawberries or take a nap or chase a rabbit and kill and eat it. Nobody stopped you from doing that. And you didn't have to rely on anybody else to do any of those things. But that's not really freedom, Rousseau says, because you're basically still governed by instinct. You're much closer to being an animal, albeit a wild animal, an animal who can run free and do whatever its instincts prompted to do, but that's not really freedom, Rousseau says. Okay, so what does he mean by that then? Well, and I'm going to read a passage here where he kind of sums up, and you see how different this is from what he says in the Discourse on Inequality, how much more favorable a view he has here of society and government compared to the state of nature. So this is in book 1, the very beginning of your selection from part 7 of book 1 of the Civil State, okay? So Rousseau says, this passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces in man a very remarkable change by substituting in his conduct justice for instinct, and by giving his actions the morality that they previously lacked. It is only when the voice of duty succeeds physical impulsion, and right succeeds appetite, that man, who till then had only looked after himself, sees that he is forced to act on other principles and to consult his reason before listening to his inclinations. Okay, really important distinction here between morality on the one hand and kind of something like nature on the other hand. Reason versus inclinations, justice versus impulse. Okay, so the idea is that we have these inclinations, these natural inclinations that belong more to our animal nature. And then we have reason and morality and justice, and they're quite different. And they're really kind of opposed, okay? Now compare that to Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas. Remember, Aquinas talked about natural law. What's good for us by our nature, yeah, we have an animal nature, and therefore we want to reproduce and educate our offspring and do a few other things like that. But we also have a distinctively human nature, which there's a kind of a harmony between these things. There can be conflict, right? Obviously, you can have conflict between two good things. But the idea that there's a sharp distinction. On the one hand, we have nature and our animal nature and inclination. On the other hand, we have duty and justice and reason. And we'll see Immanuel Kant is the one who really develops this and really kind of says that there's really this really firm distinction, an important distinction. To understand morality, you have to understand this and base the whole concept on this distinction or even this tension or even opposition. Rousseau starts to bring this out. And again, Aquinas, Aristotle, they don't necessarily see it that way. They're aware, obviously, there can be moral conflict. Sometimes, well, I'm supposed to go fight in battle, but I'm afraid and I don't want to. I'm supposed to stay up all night and keep guard, and I'm tired. I'm supposed to do this thing for the community, and I would rather do this thing that is kind of selfishly good for me, but I also have this impulse to do these things. So, and again, this comes from my nature. So nature kind of informs all of this. Rousseau's starting to get into, not nearly as radical as what happens later, but you can see the beginnings of this, okay? So again, I'll go back to reading this, okay? So he says, this passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces in man a very remarkable change by substituting in his conduct justice for instinct, and by giving his actions the morality that they previously lacked. It is only when the voice of duty succeeds physical impulsion and right succeeds appetite that man, who till then had only looked after himself, sees that he is forced to act on other principles and to consult his reason before listening to his inclinations. Although in this state he is deprived of many advantages he holds from nature, he gains such great ones in return that his faculties are exercised and developed, his ideas are expanded, his feelings are ennobled. His whole soul is exalted to such a degree that, if the abuses of this new condition did not often degrade him below that from which he has emerged, he should ceaselessly bless the happy moment that removed him from it forever, and transformed him from a stupid and ignorant animal into an intelligent being and a man. Okay, so here it is. He says, now oftentimes the reality of society degrades people so that they're worse than they were in the state of nature. It makes them slaves. They're oppressed. They're not developing the way that they should. They're forced to be immoral to survive. They're in unjust and exploitative political and economic structures, and they have to do immoral things just to survive, and therefore they end up being far more degraded. So they're actually worse off in society. But if it were done properly, Rousseau says, then they would go from being a dumb and ignorant animal to a being, to an actual moral creature, to a real human being. Okay, so humanity becomes not the development of nature, but almost this thing that emerges kind of when we pull ourselves out of it. Okay, because again, he's aware of what were we by nature. We weren't political. We weren't moral. We were isolated individuals. Okay, and for Rousseau, he's kind of saying, so this is how you do this then. This is how you can have that natural freedom, but it develops into something that is actually much better than what we have in the state of nature. In the state of nature, you could do whatever you want to, but that's not really human. Doing whatever you want to isn't really human. What is human is being a rational, moral being and kind of living that kind of life, and you have to be in society to do that. Okay, but it's not the development of nature, as Aristotle and Aquinas and others said. It's not necessarily a matter of living according to nature. You don't want to go against nature, but again, you're getting the idea at the beginning of this separation, okay, which again, Kant, for instance, will develop much more, okay? So, and that's where Rousseau talks about the general will, okay? How do you do this? Well, you get into the general will, and the general will legislates, okay? And he says a lot about that, and we don't need to get into all of it, but the idea of the general will is generality, universality, that's obviously what reason is, right? Take a really simple example. 2 plus 2 is 4 for everybody. Okay, it's not like 2 plus 2 is 4 for me, and it's 8 for you, and it's 9 for this person, and it's 5 for that person. Reason is universal, and therefore morality is. And again, we'll see Kant will really develop this with his idea of the categorical imperative. Somebody asks me to do something and I don't want to do it, but I feel awkward saying no. I make up a lie and say I already have plans. Well, why not? What's the harm in me doing that? Well, Kant will say, well, think about it. Are you saying that people should be able to, if you try to universalize that, apply that as a general rule to everybody's actions? What if everybody lied every time they were uncomfortable? What if everybody lied just to get out of social awkwardness? You can immediately imagine all kinds of negative consequences. So when you take what you can always find excuses for yourself, because you can always find excuses for yourself why you shouldn't have to do that, why you got out of this, why it's, in this case, it's okay for you to do this. If you apply that as a general rule to everybody, you quickly see, well, people are going to do all kinds of things. And if people are just going to lie all the time, then it's even going to kind of self-destruct. If people are just going to lie all the time, anytime that they feel awkward about something, you're just going to stop believing anything anybody says. So the idea is, universality, this kind of general, the fact that you can apply this universally, that becomes kind of the basis of morality. And Rousseau says that's the thing about the general will. And that's why he has these, sometimes people say, he has that famous, somewhat ominous line, man must be forced to be free. What happens when you're in a society that has the general will, that is actually kind of, succeeding in being a relatively good society, and people don't want to follow the law. So he has these ideas, the general will creates the law. When it comes to implementing it, magistrates, things like that, that's different. Those are specific applications. But in terms of creating the law for the society, he says it should be the general will, the people as a whole, and they need to recognize what is good for the society as a whole. Okay? And what about when somebody comes in conflict with that? He says in that case, then they are in violation of the general will. And so they recognize then that, my private will might be at odds with what is good for the society as a whole, with the common good, with what the general will has legislated, but the general will guarantees kind of what is appropriate. When it comes to deciding individual cases, what's going to happen here or there, general will can lay out the general principles, but individual decisions have to be made by people, and that's no longer necessarily the general will, because he says the general will doesn't deal with individuals, and the law should never deal with individuals. It can set up certain classes, it can set up all kinds of things, and it can set the conditions for them, but it can't single out individual people. So he has that, again, that kind of famous, slightly ominous line, what if somebody understands what the general will is? And it's important here that Rousseau is not talking about some mysterious thing that somebody will hand down on high. We can all understand what the general will is. Okay, there's a flood coming for the, I mean, let's look right now with the coronavirus. We shouldn't hoard supplies. We definitely shouldn't hoard medical supplies when medical doctors and nurses and so on need them. We should practice these things that are, we shouldn't price gouge if we're in a position to sell things. We should practice social distancing so as not to overwhelm the, hospitals and whatnot. We should do all these things, and we can really understand why, and we can see how this is good for the society as a whole. Maybe I want to do whatever for whatever reason, but it's really obvious. It's not like there's some sort of mysterious source for the law or for the general will. It's something we can all see very immediately. Okay, so when my private interests or just my private inclinations, as he says, conflict with the general will, what happens then? And again, that's where he says you're going to have duty, you're going to have morality, you're going to have law, you're going to have what the general will says, and what you can very easily, readily recognize is the general will. But as an individual, you may go against that. Your individual will may not be in harmony with that. And again, you can see what's right, but maybe you want to do what's wrong instead. Maybe you're supposed to do whatever and you just don't want to do it, okay? What happens in that situation? Well, Rousseau says the society, the law, the government should step in and make sure that you do it. As he says, they must be forced to be free, because we recognize freedom is, again, giving ourselves these laws, legislating for ourselves, and therefore being in accord with the general will. That's the only way to really be free. So when I recognize what the right thing is to do, and I want to do something else because it's easier or it suits my interest in some other way, I get more money or I get more comfort or more whatever, Rousseau says we're not really being free in that case. Because again, freedom is doing what is rational, what is moral, and we can see very clearly what that is in a good society. That'll be enacted by the general will. Okay, so what happens when people don't want to march in line with the general will? As he puts it, they must be forced to be free, but he's not saying that the law or the general will isolates individuals, okay? Everything is in general terms, okay? And that's why he says, so the idea, sometimes people say that he's a kind of a proto-authoritarian, and you can kind of see that, but that's not really what he's saying, okay? I mean, or at least he certainly has limitations on what the general will can do, on what the law can do in terms of individuals. So he has a lot of attempts there, and part of that is just about what it means to have a general will and general principles of legislation versus individual applications, or what to do when somebody disobeys the law. But there's also this idea that, yeah, I mean, you have to protect against abuse of power and so on. So he's not really, I mean, maybe you still see him as an authoritarian in some way, but he's certainly not somebody who embraces or is blind to or allows or is opening the door to some of the abuses that authoritarian societies do. He kind of has ways that he tries to limit what the law can do. And again, part of that is just the idea that we're talking about general terms. The general will is going to talk about generalities, not about what this person should happen or what should happen to this group. But again, part of it is because he's aware that some limits need to be set to the law. Okay, so I said I was going to try to make this shorter. I think it's already been close to half an hour, so I'm going to try to be relatively quick here. Okay. So two more quick points, okay, which I've already talked about, this tension, the opposition between nature and inclination, morality and duty. We'll see this really developed by Kant, okay? Again, obvious contrast with Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, thinkers like that. Morality, remember, is happiness. Remember Aristotle's idea of, morality, virtue as happiness. That's part of what it is. Obviously, the practice of virtue can make you unhappy. Obviously, a virtuous person sometimes has to do things that might make them unhappy, or that are dangerous, or that they're not sure what's going to happen, or it means giving up something that they really want. It's not as if virtue never has a personal cost. Obviously, it does. But the idea that it's fundamentally opposed to happiness or to inclination or something, that's definitely not what Aristotle or Thomas thought. Morality is happiness. It's a certain kind of thriving. The full development and realization of one's nature, right? Your nature is you want to practice the virtues. You want to develop into this type of person. So it's a very different view of what morality and justice and things like that are, to say that they're opposed to inclination. And maybe even kind of opposed to nature, opposed to what we were originally in the state of nature, opposed to our animal nature. Again, for the ancients and medievals, it's more virtue is a kind of happiness, and it's a happiness that comes from fully developing our nature. Not a rejection of happiness in favor of duty that's only known by a kind of reason, but a kind of reason that is very abstract. It's sort of reason tells you, well, what is a general principle that could apply to everybody? That's what morality is. rather than practicing certain virtues. And then oftentimes for Aristotle, for Thomas Aquinas, for people like that, morality will in part be a matter of a particular judgment that you have to make in a given situation to figure out, okay, these are the general principles, how do they apply here? Less I have the general principles that morality consists in because I know what reason has told me are universal principles, and I always need to adhere to those, and more, well, what is the right thing to do in this situation? How would I best practice courage or justice or moderation or generosity or whatever in this particular situation, okay? And yeah, we'll see this more with Kant, okay? The other thing, and I'm just going to say this very briefly, because no, just to finish this, the other thing, the idea when Rousseau talks about alienation, and again, this develops more after Rousseau himself, but when Rousseau talks about alienation, there's kind of the beginning of this idea that things are really fundamentally wrong in society, that there was something natural and we've been alienated, we've really been wrenched out of the way that things should be, okay? Again, by the time of the social contract, Rousseau sees the state of nature as good but kind of lacking. We can develop into something more than that, but we can also develop into something far worse, okay? So, state of nature, at the best, we develop into something more, into something fully human, but oftentimes society is unjust, it's perverted, it's wrong, and it turns us into something far worse, okay? So the idea is that things are really fundamentally wrong, and we've been alienated. Something really essential has been wrenched out of us, and we're just living the absolute wrong kind of life as people, as individuals, as a race, as a society, as all of it. The entire human race, individual societies, every individual, okay, every class in society, everything is just fundamentally wrong. It needs to be changed, okay? Well, with Hobbes, you have this kind of weird mixture of extreme radicalism. Remember how he talked about kind of remaking the world? Remember in the introduction to the Leviathan, he talked about creating our own Leviathan. So on the one hand, there's this extreme kind of radicalism, this idea that we can reason now, can really, in science, can kind of understand the world and transform it in a way that's never been possible. But along with that in Hobbes, you have this kind of extreme conservatism. Everybody should obey the government. Everybody should defer to the sovereign. Everybody should be relatively obedient or even absolutely obedient to an absolute sovereign. Locke is more open to revolution, but still not quite as radical as Rousseau. So this idea of alienation and that society really needs to be totally transformed in a way, according to what we now understand. Not necessarily in a kind of technical, scientific way, Hobbes, like Hobbes thought, Hobbes being kind of a proto-technocrat in some ways, but maybe even more fundamentally than that. So it's not necessarily that we continue with a kind of absolute monarchy, and meanwhile we use technology and science and a certain understanding of the world to better manage the world. We need to really change society, okay? This gets built on by later thinkers like Marx, obviously, and this idea of changing society to bring it into line with, or to make it accord with more kind of abstract ideas that we may have come up with. This is what Edmund Burke, for instance, will be very skeptical about. You'll see some of this in the French Revolution, and that's what Burke is concerned about with, and we'll read some selections from his book on the French Revolution, and that's kind of part of what he's concerned about. The idea is that you take a long developing organic, he sees society as basically kind of an organic thing that has developed over time, and there are a lot of parts of it that we may not fully understand the reason for, but they shouldn't just be thrown away because we can't figure out the reason. Or if we sit down and we figure out a kind of an abstract set of principles and we say this is the way that society should be, and these are the institutions that stand in the way, therefore we need to destroy them. In the case of the French Revolution, that's almost everything: the monarchy, the aristocracy, the church, all kinds of things. And we'll talk about the problems with seeing some of these things this way as just sort of organic societal productions. But anyways, Burke will be much more critical of this, or skeptical. The idea that we should remake society according to a set of abstract principles, Burke sees as more, even if society is deeply flawed, maybe there's a reason that it has the form that it has. Maybe some of these particular institutions and groups and whatever that seem exploitative and seem backwards and seem as if they're making society, holding society back, and are kind of the source or the, whatever of oppression and things like that, maybe they serve an important purpose that we don't fully understand because, and therefore we should be very, very hesitant and skeptical about claims that we need to remake society according to these abstract principles and new philosophies, okay? So that is, again, almost 40 minutes. Sorry, I was hoping for more like 10. I guess I get going and don't realize how much I'm speaking. But there is, in kind of in general terms, I hope that that's useful. Some general comments about Rousseau, about the social contract, how it's different than the discourse on inequality, but how it kind of fits into ancient modern thought, what it has in common with each. So hopefully that's useful for your papers and for your personal growth and enlightenment and everything. So that's all.